This video is brought to you in part by Squarespace. Shoutout the Hedgehog. Back when he made his first appearance, many Sonic fans and game journalists of the day saw this hedgehog as the arbiter for what has been coined as the dark age of Sonic games. After all, it was with his debut game we saw the end of the Dreamcast, Sega's final attempt to be a contender in the console market, and it was his game that first popped on to its main competitor's machine. And after that, you'd get the very mixed reception of Sonic Heroes, and then the often lambasted Shoutout the Hedgehog. But of course, none of these games would come even close to the infamy that was Sonic 2006, a game that would haunt and radically change the direction of the franchise going forward. And none of this is even bringing up the behind-the-scenes nightmare that had to be developing all these titles. It was in these days you would hear the term Dark Age of Sonic, and of course rough transition into 3D, complaints about expanded casts, but no matter where anyone threw the blame, there's often only one character that was put to blame for any of this. Shoutout was the through line for all of these games, and all the guns and PG-rated curse words of his title game didn't help that image. Were those complaints justified? Well, all of that's debated to this day, but there is no denying that the franchise had a tanking reputation, and it's still having a hard time recovering from it to this day. But no matter how many complaints were thrown around, the actual audience these games were directed at did find something special in each and every one of these titles. That audience was, of course, kids, the next generation of fans to adopt this franchise, the Shoutout generation. And now, after all these years, they finally have a game all their own. Well, okay, it is a game for them, but not just for them. Because not only do we have a new game that is representing the most notorious titles of the Sonic franchise, this game also has to serve as a promotion for an upcoming movie, and in turn serve as an introduction to the character of Shoutout and the overall franchise, all while being a return to form for longtime fans and act as a sequel to multiple games in the Sonic franchise. And all of this has to be done by what is essentially an extra pack-in for a Sonic game re-release. But not only does this game accomplish all of these things, it even got this bitter old Sonic fan with way too high of expectations to say Shoutout Generations is easily one of the greatest games in the entire Sonic series. I'm that bitter old fan, by the way. Hello there, I'm Nick, and this is Unapologetic, where we take a look at what can only be described as the redemption of Shoutout the Hedgehog. Before we carry on, I want to take a moment to talk about today's sponsor, Squarespace. Jumping online and building up your own brand was always an intimidating thing for me, but Squarespace makes that a streamlined, fast, and easy process, all while making you look good thanks to their Fluid Engine, a next-generation website design tool that lets you tweak any of their many templates with easy-to-use drag-and-drop tools. And I don't need to tell you how useful websites can be, whether you want to build up a portfolio of your work, an art gallery, or a shop, because yes, they have everything you need to run your own online business, including analytics that help show you the strongest avenues of growth and help you build up marketing strategies, which include integration with your favorite social media networks. And they can even help you set up an online shop to sell and distribute custom merch. All you have to do is design it and they'll handle production, inventory, and shipping. Really doesn't get any easier than that. And to make it just a bit easier, if you use my link, squarespace.com/gameapologist, you'll get 14 days for free, which is plenty of time to see if this is right for you. And when you want to make a purchase, that same link will get you 10% off your first order. Thank you again to Squarespace for sponsoring the video. I'm going to take you through each and everything this game set out to do and how it succeeded on almost every front, and point out the spots it could improve going forward. And I'm going to be using a lot of basic Sonic game jargon and some common lore nonsense, so if you don't know what I mean when I talk about boosting or homing attacks or chaos emeralds or shooting sick little kids in space, well, I got a whole channel for you to explore, or better still, just go play Shoutout Generations for yourself, because that's the first point I want to make. This is a fantastic introduction to not only the character of Shoutout, but to Sonic games in general. I'll get into more detail of the general gameplay and unlockables a little later, but for first timers or parents wondering if this game is a good fit for your kid, or if you're just looking for a good platformer to play, yes, on both fronts. The Hedgie is still edgy, but if you got a kid old enough to comprehend a controller and words, then they can probably handle the darker elements this game alludes to. They do it very tastefully, and at the same time do a fantastic job catching you up on the history both in and out of the game world as you explore these stages. I would just recommend that you play the attached Sonic Generations first, as that too will do a great job acting as a jump on point for the franchise. But there you go, game is good, and you got my recommendation if you're not experienced with Sonic games. It's an all ages franchise, and it's always great to have more fans to gush about these games with. So please go play it and then come back and tell me what you think about it in the comments. And then hopefully the rest of this video will make some kind of sense, because from here on out I'm going to be talking with the assumption that you have played some Sonic games prior to this point. This game covers a lot of history of the franchise, and that's going to require me to reference other titles quite a bit. We can't stop to explain every single one of them. I promise I'll get back to reviewing the rest of the series, and I promise I will eventually review Sonic Generations proper. The Shadow campaign is already so expansive, I won't be reviewing the Sonic of Sonic X Shadow Generations. That deserves its own separate video, and this game deserves its own video. So let's get on with it. Shadow Generations is good. Real damn good. And I think a lot of us who are paying attention to the pre-release knew it was going to be good. Yeah, I know about the Sonic cycle, whatever, shut up. We've done that song and dance long enough. And Sega has a certain energy when it comes to the lead up of a new Sonic release. I would say the last few games have overall been a pretty solid fun time, but they weren't perfect. But again, us fans who are paying attention caught on to all the problems of those games before they ever came out. Gee, there seems to be a lot of bloom on this Sonic model. Hey, why are they showing S3K in standard definition? How far are they in the development of this thing? Where's Christian Whitehead? What's with all that poppin' in that IGN preview? That's not Green Hill in that footage, right? Surely not again. And who are these Arzest folks? What have they worked on before? Oh no! Yeah, we've gotten pretty good at sniffing this stuff out. But Shadow Generations, like Sonic Generations during its initial release, just had this exciting energy around it. And with each new trailer, hype just grew more and more palpable. And that's not to mention all the special editions they were releasing with this game. I keep saying it, but a clear sign that Sega is proud of a Sonic game, they will make a big, silly special edition. Now, look, I know Colors Ultimate had that weird Japan exclusive thing with the book, and Origins had that odd European release like a year after the game came out. Those are more obscure. I don't really count them. I really gotta do a video about Sonic Collector's Editions. Anyway, my point is, the energy surrounding this release was similar to the excitement I saw leading up to the release of both Sonic Generations and Sonic Mania, which are both easily regarded by many as some of the best of the Sonic series, period. And I'm happy to report Shadow Generations definitely delivered on its hype. But I have to admit, that wasn't always the case. Look, I wasn't a fan of most of Shadow's games, but I've always liked the character. And yeah, I was excited to see him show up in that initial reveal trailer, but like many others, I was incredibly confused. I thought it was a little weird, if not forced, to slap Shadow into a game like Sonic Generations. And I think a lot of us weren't expecting much outside of a skin swap and maybe a few extra levels like Force's episode Shadow. I mean, we don't even get a classic Shadow to act as a counterpoint to classic Sonic. Still want that, by the way. I didn't expect it to happen, but I still want it. And actually, you know what? If you consider the concept art you unlock in the game, I mean, that kind of counts. You know what? I'm calling that a win. Point for Nick. On the surface, yeah, it seems obvious and forced. Shadow is a big draw of the new movie, so of course they have to promote him somehow in a game. But what relevance does he have slapped between classic and modern Sonic? Well, as more trailers dropped, it became clear that's exactly where he should be. Let's go on our own time travel adventure and rewind the clock a bit. During the initial development of Sonic Generations, the team had thrown around the idea of a third Sonic to represent a Dreamcast era. But as the project progressed, obviously that idea was scrapped. And yeah, I know a lot of us fans would have loved a more stylized, maybe even low poly Sonic. I mean, heck, we do have a skin for it now, but I can understand the choice to skip a third Sonic. Outside of the hardest of hardcore fans debating quill length, the only real drastic shift in character design was from classic to adventure, now known as modern Sonic. Longer quills, green eyes, all that fun stuff. Yes, things would shift from model to model, and they've largely kept the same certain model since 2008 with some slight variations, but long and short of it, Green Eyes Sonic has just been modern Sonic ever since Sonic Adventure, and we wouldn't see another drastic redesign like this until until Sonic Boom, or the movie version of the character, which, now that I think about it, also got its own drastic redesign. Anyway, my point is, a Dreamcast Sonic would have been just a bit too redundant, but now that we've circled back around to this generation's re-release, I still wouldn't bring in a third Sonic to represent that era, but I would still represent that era, because as we have seen in a lot of discussions around generations in this past decade, there were still elements that a lot of fans were missing from the franchise. A larger emphasis on plot and the characters, true 3D gameplay, all of the things we missed from the adventure games. All of that stuff does deserve representation, but I wouldn't use Sonic to represent those games. I would use Shadow. Now, it's true he wasn't present in the first Sonic Adventure game, but he is the through line of the rest of those games. He was the central draw of Sonic Adventure 2, and it was his story that we followed through the other games, far more than any other character. Even with the expansive casts or the introduction of a third Hedgehog later on, Shadow's story was always the most compelling. There's a reason why he got the spin-off game during this era. Yes, a lot of us older fans blamed the introduction of the character as the reason the games got so rough, but obviously game design is not that simple to describe, and even then, they weren't making the games for us older fans, but they did show us love here and there, more often than I think some folks want to admit, but I digress. The objective was to draw in a larger audience that didn't already have a Sega machine. As much as we love the Dreamcast, Sonic Adventure 2 didn't exactly save the system, and I'd argue that Shadow here is a large reason why the Sonic franchise thrived on other platforms. He's not the only reason, same as he's not the only reason these games were floundering in terms of critical reception back in the day, but he is still a major reason why there was success at all. If you're one of those people who started their journey with this franchise on the GameCube, or heck, maybe the original Xbox, PS2, or on the next generation with the 360 or PS3, it's very, very likely that Shadow is one of, if not your favorite character. He was just that compelling, and his popularity dictated a lot of the direction these games went in, for better or worse. So yes, Shadow is exactly where he belongs on that cover, right in between the classic and modern era. He is the adventure era. He is the long-lost Dreamcast Sonic you've been waiting for. Because he doesn't just bring in levels based off all of the titles he's appeared in, he also brings along a larger emphasis on plot and characters and true 3D gameplay. And because of that reason, you've likely heard Shadow Generations serves as a sequel to Sonic Generations, or Sonic Frontiers, or Shadow's own game. And in a lot of ways, it serves as a sequel to all three. But let's first explain why it's a sequel to Sonic Generations. It takes a lot of ideas and improves upon them, as it should, since Sonic Generations was released 13 years ago. But in this sense, it also serves as a long-lost missing piece that truly completes the full Sonic Generations experience. I love Sonic Generations, but it is a very short game. And as I've already stated, it was missing some glaringly important elements if it was meant to represent the entire franchise. Shadow Generations does feel like a massive improvement over the general gameplay, but at the same time, it does feel like a full, robust experience, especially considering that both campaigns separately are only a few hours long. But it's also a sequel to Shadow 05 because it continues the story picked up by that game. But we're going to wait till later to get into that in case you're worried about narrative spoilers. And it is a sequel to Sonic Frontiers because despite the hiccups, that was still a fun game that brought in some fun new ideas that were also worth expanding on. And Shadow here does exactly that. To give you a basic idea of what this game is, because, you know, that's just how video essays work, it's a set of action stages held together by a large playground of a hub known as the White Space. Here, Shadow has to face off against the returning threat of Black Doom in a story that runs concurrently to Sonic's time-traveling adventure. And if you're familiar with other Boost games, you'll be just fine here. But unlike almost every other Boost game, hell, any other 3D Sonic game, there's no needless fluff here. No werehogs, no wisps, fishing, mechs, none of that. Or so it seems, but I guess you could say that this open zone could count as filler, or maybe those forced challenge stages. I mean, you can't beat the game without taking those on. And hell, if you're gonna throw wisps into that list, then surely I must include the Doom powers as well, right? Those have to count as fluff, or at least pointless gimmicks, certainly. And sure, all of that is here to expand playtime, but unlike everything else I listed, none of the learned abilities in Shadow Generations requires you to learn an entirely different skill set. It instead requires you to expand on the core boost gameplay. Everything is designed with Shadow's moves in mind. Act 1's 3D stages, Act 2's side-scrolling, the open zone white space, the challenges, the bosses, everything you learn in one is useful everywhere else. And this basic fundamental element of game design is lacking in every other 3D Sonic game. And this has been a complaint about Sonic games since the first adventure. This is why there were so many complaints about the extended cast. Rough transition, nothing. People liked how 3D Sonic played, but they liked playing Sonic. They wanted to play more Sonic levels, or in Adventure 2's case, Sonic and Shadow levels. But Sonic Team, bless their hearts, would always learn the wrong lessons or severely overcorrect. Even in the games that focused strictly on one character, they would still goof it up. Sonic Unleashed, you're spending most of the game as a werehog. Sonic Colors seems pretty straightforward, but I'm sorry, those wisps just stopped everything dead in their tracks most of the time. And if not that, the level design and that blocky platforming, I have a whole video complaining about that stuff. And of course, Shadow's own game, even though they gave us one single hedgehog to focus on, I was so sure they were finally going to give us a game of pure high-speed levels. They instead gave us a bunch of boring, tedious missions and vehicles that just hampered the flow of the game. I bring all of this up because Shadow Generations feels like that promise was finally fulfilled. I finally got the Shadow game I always wanted. Yes, you can count the white space or the challenges or even the side-scrolling Act 2s as filler, but I'm sorry, they all play beautifully and they all stay focused on that central core Shadow gameplay. The mechanics and the powers and all of it translates beautifully between 2, 2.5, and 3D gameplay. And look, I know Frontiers is fun, but there is a jarring difference between the open zone and the boost stages. The Psyloop and combat is completely useless in the boost stages, and hell, the physics aren't even consistent between the two. Now, don't get me wrong, the physics slightly changed between the action stages and white space here in Shadow Generations, but it's nowhere near as noticeable, especially since there's no stupid physics sliders this time around. Now, there is quite the difference when you compare this to Sonic's campaign, as again, there should be, since that game was released 13 years ago, but even when you compare this to Sonic Frontiers, I feel like Sonic can move around a little bit more freely, especially when he's airborne, which is fine. White space is nowhere near as open as the Starfall Islands, and everything here is designed around the physics on display rather than the loosey-goosey business of Sonic Frontiers. I really do not like physics sliders in my platformers, and this time there's no awkward puzzles or combat sections, no light RPG progression to unlock a bunch of moves I can only use in the open zone. You unlock a Doom power here, and then you can use it everywhere else in the game without it ever interrupting the game flow. Are there elements I missed from past games? Sure. I'm not saying that all that extra stuff isn't fun. I had a blast with almost everything I've listed thus far. Still not a fan of the werehog, but I promise I will go back and give that a fair shake. I've never properly beaten that game. But I digress. What I'm saying here is that there has been a lot of inconsistent designs when it comes to 3D Sonic games, and even my precious classic games had a problem with interrupting game flow with drastic changes in level design. That's literally the biggest complaint of Sonic 1. We have heard time and again from Sonic Team how necessary it is to pad out games when you can zip through levels so quickly, but very rarely do they ever build out of that core gameplay experience. Instead, they let us go fishing. I know all of you love the Chow Garden. I get it. I know. I ain't playing a Sonic game to babysit. I'm sorry. I'm just not. Again, that extra stuff isn't bad, but it just feels fairly obvious they didn't have a clear idea of what to do with the core gameplay. Here in Shadow Generations, they keep things nice and clean by giving us some new powers to make Shadow stand out from Sonic and stay zoned in on those mechanics. You don't have a drop dash, spin dash, light ring dash, guns, and hell, I'm always going to want a 3D game with classic physics or a true return to adventure physics, but they designed a game that didn't need any of that. And the new powers do a fantastic job of incorporating with the standard moveset. But I saw what you did there, trailer, making us think combat was making a return. Oh, you sassy little trickster. All right, so this is a very, very minor nitpick. Doesn't actually bother me, but it is kind of needless. These Dragon Ball ass attack animations, maybe that is kind of filler a little bit. Very, 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 very tiny filler, but I mean, they could have just had them launch into enemies with a spin attack that probably would have been a little bit faster and done more damage, but who cares? It looks cool. And it turns out all that punching and kicking, that's actually part of a Doom power. And I've mentioned them so many times up to this point, let's just get them out of the way. But before that, let's talk about Shadow's Chaos abilities, like his iconic Chaos Control, a move you can use at the very start of the game. And they very clearly incorporated both slowing down time, which is awesome because it also just completely stops the level timer for 5 seconds, which is great for cleaning up S ranks, but they also incorporated a warp as well. When you use Chaos Control, at very specific spots, you'll see a glowing green patch of light. You touch those to be instantly transported to a specific spot elsewhere in the level. I thought that's kind of cool. There's been a lot of debates on what exactly Chaos Control is supposed to be. Does it slow down time? Does it warp? Well, why not both? It's both. And you do get the Chaos Spear, which is just a little bolt of power that Shadow can shoot off. But it does become more powerful once Doom abilities are rolled in. The first proper one is the Doom Spear, which upgrades that Chaos Spear so you can lock on to multiple targets. You use these to solve some light puzzles, or clear out a bunch of oncoming attacks at the same time, or paralyze specific baddies that would otherwise hurt you if you were to attack them head on. Not dissimilar to the lock-on ability of the Tornado during Sonic Adventure, or Panzer Dragoon, if you guys still remember those games. I hope you do. It's a very simple little ability, but as the game progresses on, it does demand you get a little bit quicker with it. I did find it to be a lot of fun. But anyway, let's carry on. The next Doom power is called Doom Blast. This lets you launch some very specific enemies into the air, aim them, and use them as a warp point to get to out of reach areas, or just straight up skip over certain obstacles. And yes, this is the one you saw in the trailer that tricked me into thinking that there was going to be some Sonic Frontier style combat. Next up is Doomster, and as you'd expect, it allows you to traverse over water, equipping you with a side swap ability to help you maneuver, break boxes, or ricochet things. And after that, you'll unlock the Doom Morph. Now this one shows up later in the game, and I can understand why. It's pretty easy to wrap your head around all these other abilities thus far, but the Morph takes a little getting used to, and the game isn't exactly upfront on how to use it. This is easily the most complex of the powers. Basically, you have to hit a goo pile so you can then hit another goo pile if you want to swing through the air or traverse through purple goo along the ground or on a wall. And while you're in the goo, you can do a speed boost, but beware because you will suddenly find yourself with Sonic Heroes style physics. Things get quite squirrely. And oh yeah, that swinging stuff I just mentioned, that's the part that isn't well explained. Like I said, you have to grab one of these goo orbs for that initial transformation, and if you're in proximity of another goo orb, you can reach out to it and snap yourself to it, or if you time it right, you can actually stretch that tendril once it connects, and if you release the button at the right time, you will launch your inky, angry octopus a further distance. I gotta admit, this felt more like the 3D Sonic learning experience I was used to. It was frustrating while I was figuring it out, and I do think this power could have used a little bit more time in the oven, but that said, once you understand how it works and you get the hang of it, it's very satisfying to pull off. It's a little bit more complicated than the other powers, but it is creative, and not too far off from stretchy werehog arms, and if they play around with this a little bit more, I might start demanding a 3D Rystar game or a playable Tangle. It's a fun concept, you just have to be a bit patient with this one. And of course, last but not least is the Doom Wing. I feel like I'm saying Doom too much. Do I make a Dr. Doom reference or an Invader Zim Doom song reference? I don't know, I've been writing too much as it is, so take your pick. Anyway, the wings break the game, and it took me a while to get a proper handle on it. Like the Morph, I wasn't a big fan at first. Didn't know when it was wise or risky to bust these babies out during gameplay, but I think that's kind of the point. This is, for all intents and purposes, the super form of this campaign. And like any good super form, this gives you a lot of power, but it comes at a cost, and the game demands you have a firm grasp on everything else leading up to this point if you are meant to wield these things. And good God, just look at them. No, we don't have guns or curse words, but man, they brought in the 2000s edge so hard with these things. Oh my lord, this better be a shirt at Hot Topic right now.
My online alter ego is 18 feet tall and has giant wings, like an angel's, but also like a demon's. His name is Carlor.
But yeah, as cool as they look, you don't actually fly with them. You glide. And at the cost of your boost meter, you'll have to grab rings or more likely make landfall to refill before you take off again. And boosting or not, this form will drain rings like any good super form. That means you'll have to pay attention to 2 different meters, all while navigating the skies and hoping you don't drop off into a bottomless pit. Again, at first, I wasn't really feeling it with these things. Almost wondered if these levels were even designed for them, but they aren't meant to be used all the time. game. Like any other power, they need to be used at very specific portions, and the limitations and unlocking them at the end of the game puts a cap on just how severely you can break the game with these wings. But make no mistake, if you get a handle on these things, you'll be doing just that. Thankfully, everything seems to be properly considered, because once you unlock the wings, you also unlock a toggle to turn them on and off in the stage menus, and a secondary letter grading set that can only appear while you're using the Doom wings. And this is when you unlock the hard mode trials for the open zone and some extra challenge stages. So even if you want to clean up collectibles, that's fine. You'll likely have collected most of everything else during that initial run, and by this point, you've earned a little extra help. And even if you attempt to grab all the collectibles with the wings and the boost stages, well, I mean, good luck. That won't work every time, and even then, you can't break the S ranks in normal runs anyway. I know a lot of this seems obvious, but when you consider the Final Horizons DLC of Sonic Frontiers and how easy it was to break everything once you unlock all those extra powers, I do think this was very well considered when they were putting together this game and these maps and these powers. I do still have to mention, these feel like an obvious evolution of things that have come before. Yeah, I said that these are better than the Wisps, but you can see how these were inspired by the Wisps. Hell, that morph is practically a symbiote Wisp. The difference now is it just feels like everything builds on the joy that is moving around your main character. And as the game carries on and it requires you to mix in powers and really put that fast twitch button pressing to the test, it just feels so incredibly satisfying while you try to master these stages. The only time Shadow's abilities slow him down is if the player does not know how to properly handle the powers. And even then, it's normally a lot of fun figuring them out. I'm going to say this a lot in this video, but I feel like a lot of hardcore fans forget, since all these games are muscle memory, it shouldn't have to be a chore learning how to get the handle on these games. You shouldn't have to fight against jank or master unintentional tech just to eventually have a good time. Shadow Generations does an incredible job making the process of mastering mechanics an absolute blast. I was rarely frustrated, and even then it didn't feel like it was the game at fault. It felt like, well, it felt like it was a skill issue. And I'm sorry, that's not always as common as fans want to make you believe when it comes to Sonic games. I was genuinely impressed with how well these powers were incorporated. Ironically enough, if we do have to compare the Doom abilities to Wisps, I'd compare them more to the DS version of Sonic Colors and how they handle Wisps, because that game did a much better job maintaining the flow than its console counterpart. And the same can be said here. Shadow slips in and out of his abilities without losing any momentum. I do need to reiterate, because I know some of you will hear me say one line begging on something you like in an old game and just forget all the nuance I'm trying to bring to the table here. I'm not saying those other abilities are bad, and I'm not even saying Shadow's abilities are better. I'm simply saying that they did a brilliant job incorporating them into the general design of the game, be it in the hub world or the stages, and they mostly did a great job teaching you how to use them in fun ways. If you don't mind stopping everything to go fishing or unlock new combat moves and side looping, that's great. All of that is fun too. If anything, those are just things that give those other titles their own identity. Shadow Generations isn't a replacement for the other Sonic games that comes before it. It's a celebration of them in so many ways, and one of those ways is saying, look how far we've come and look at how I've learned from all those past adventures. Shadow Generations just feels like a game that's showing a lot of growth, polish, and confidence, and in turn, I also think it gives Shadow a much needed playstyle identity. I know the guns weren't all that bad when you got used to them in his title game, but I don't know. It always felt so forced, and the Chaos powers weren't all that useful or fun. Shadow was just a Sonic clone. Outside of his design and backstory, he really didn't have anything unique when it came to traversal abilities like Tails or Knuckles. I mean, he could ride a bike, I guess, but Shadow Generations not only does a great job keeping that flow state going, all of them make sense for the character of Shadow, even if most of them will only be temporary for the sake of this narrative. That said, they do require a lot more buttons than other Sonic games. Most of the time it's fine, but I will say scrunching up like 3 different fingers on the top shoulder buttons while keeping another on the button pad, it can get a little bit busy on that controller. And the later abilities, again, will require a little bit to get a handle on, as they will slightly shift physics. But with a little effort, you'll be throwing Doom spears while gliding on your Doom wing and then dropping into a Doom surf and then using Chaos control. Why did they use Doom so often when titling these things? Anyway, okay, then you'll freeze out a demon, and then you'll spike that demon across the air while racing through like a bat out of hell, or I guess a hedgehog in this case. It's kind of weird how often Shadow gets bat motifs, right? I mean, Rouge is right there, but they give Shadow the bigger wings. He dresses like a vampire for Halloween, and he's literally Batman for that DC crossover. Also, thinking of those wings and that manta ray, or maybe it's a devil ray, because you get it. Now that I think about it, the way you hop between those powers also makes me feel like this is a better sequel to Sonic Racing Transformed than Team Sonic Racing was. And I'm not entirely joking about that either. The boost levels are a wonderful mix of platforming and high-speed arcade racing, which, if you ask me, speaks more to the spirit of what makes Sonic games so special ever since the very beginning of the franchise. Yes, I still love my momentum-based ball physics, but incorporating the colorful thrill of arcade madness into platforming has always been what makes this franchise so special. And these specific levels are quite simply the best utilization of the boost formula I have seen thus far. It's never been my favorite form of Sonic gameplay, but I have always enjoyed it to some degree, and this game seals the deal on almost all fronts. But before I get into the boost levels proper, I should talk about the other forms of gameplay. But before I do just want to mention, because I imagine some of you are already in the comments defending some of the games I have mentioned here so far, isn't it kind of wonderful that I have just been referencing other Sonic games as opposed to comparing all of this to Mario? Isn't it great that we have a game that celebrates the history of the franchise, not just in terms of aesthetics or the story, but also showing real proper evolution in gameplay? That's wonderful. I guess there is an obvious Mario comparison to make, that being this feels like an additional campaign add-on like Bowser's Fury was to the re-release of 3D World. And yes, there is a decent amount of water here, I guess nowhere near as common as 3D World, Bowser, whatever the heck it is. So yeah, those are obvious comparisons to make, but that's where the comparisons end. Shadow Generations feels like a Sonic game. That's the most important part to me. I still don't mind them taking some notes from Mario. He is the king of gaming for a reason, and Nintendo polishes the living crap out of that, and they treat him like a proper king. I just don't need it to be so blatant all the time, because the Sonic games do have their own identity, and it is worth celebrating. In fact, let's celebrate it a bit more right now, because one of the biggest selling points to me was the promise of proper 3D exploration. Sonic Frontiers laid the groundwork for this, and it did prove me wrong about boost working in an open world, and I can still nitpick and compare it to physics of classic or adventure, or talk about the lack of polish all the live long day, but at the end of that day, I will still come to the conclusion that it was the best part of Frontiers, and it was mostly a lot of fun and worth bringing back. Simply having the announcement that the white space would play like an open zone was a selling point for me. So as much as I complain about Frontiers doing this or that, it definitely did something right if they're using open zone as a selling point, and I'm happy to hear those words. And I'm also happy to see that they fixed almost every issue I had when it comes to open zone Sonic gameplay. There's no glaring pop-in. I mean, you will still get some of it for smaller assets when you start gliding around especially, but it's really no more offensive than any other modern game. And all the landmarks and rails and everything you're actually going to be climbing around on is always in full view, which is the most important part, especially if you're trying to plan some creative route to get to some collectible or beat some kind of challenge. The water, again, can be seen as taking some inspiration from Bowser's Fury, but the aesthetic itself feels a lot more like Hollow Bastion. I know all you Shadow fans or Kingdom Hearts fans, don't even pretend like you're not. And shout out to Stevie for pointing that out. And quite frankly, I love the look of this place. Lots of gothic architecture holding together the aesthetics of the different zones you'll be visiting. Something else that really made me think about the white space in a way I never did before with that original release of Sonic Generations was the potential story being told here in the environment. I have to wonder if these castles actually mean anything. Are these from places we've never been to before from Earth? Different times from Earth? Are they architecture native to the white space? I mean, the location of the Mephiles boss gate alone is so intentionally meant to invoke the feeling of something sinister that does not belong here. Something meant to be kept out of the way. Even in a world where time no longer exists, it's still trying to keep away a creature that technically should have never existed. That's so rad. What I'm getting at is I really like the art direction and the design of the white space. So yeah, it is expanding out on the general idea of Sonic Generations, but being able to explore in 3D is an absolute treat. And while a lot of the puzzles are mostly fine in Frontiers, there were more than a few that didn't feel very Sonic-y. Shadow doesn't have anywhere near the amount of things to do, but they all work in tandem with those abilities. The only two real challenge missions you will have are time trials or ring collections, and those of course help you get a lay of the land while you get a handle on the general movement and skill set as it unlocks throughout the game. And something I saw folks praise a lot when it came to Sonic Frontiers was the general playground vibe, the experimentation leading to some clever platforming, or more specifically rail grinding for the most part. Considering the state of the game, I don't think that was always intentional when it came to the design, but here in Shadow Generations, I think that experimentation is not only intentional, it's very much incentivized. Some of the harder time trials will require you to get creative if you want to get across the map in time for the goal, and you'll have a plethora of options available to you. Even when you unlock the Doomwing, the harder time trials are built with that in mind. You won't always be able to make it across the map simply by gliding there. There were so many times I said out loud, how am I supposed to do that? And with just a couple minutes of experimentation, I was saying, oh, that's how. Now, players have already figured out some crazy tech, but you don't really need to rely on breaking the game to feel satisfied and clever with these challenges. I won't get too detailed because honestly, those are the real spoilers when it comes to Sonic gameplay. This is how puzzle solving should be incorporated, not stopping to shift around a bunch of gravestones, but rather how you can utilize the environment to your advantage to get going really fast. This in its own way was the type of thing I wanted when I whine about getting classic physics for a 3D game. The sheer joy of movement is what should be expanded on and challenged, and while these physics again aren't my favorite or even my dream 3D Sonic game, I can't dock points when it's so intentionally well designed. I desperately miss hub worlds, and none of them have been as fun as this. And hey, they actually give you collectibles this time around. No need to wait for DLC. They give you proper incentive to explore. You have 80 nuts and bolts to collect for Orbot and Cubot. Oh, and yeah, Shadow also has some fun hub world cameo characters with some fun flavor text. Just thought I'd put that out there. But yeah, back to the collectibles. They're not so many to the point where it feels exhausting. You'll likely run into most of them just from a regular playthrough, but once you get down to the last few, it can become a frustrating experience. And no, the final reward for collecting them is not satisfying, but it is still fun. You'll be collecting a lot of stuff just generally throughout the game. I am still glad the nuts and bolts are here, but maybe one of the robots could have given you a hint on the location of the last few nuts, like, hey, our sensors pick up a reading in the Kingdom Valley section of the map. I don't know. White space is not that big. Plenty of people grab all 80 all on their own, but it will be driving you crazy trying to track down the last one, I promise you. Again, I'm still glad they're here. Open world platformers should have fun collectibles. There are a couple other things to look out for though, like these balloons that hold a page of Gerald Robotnik's journal, giving you some juicy lore, and yes, we will cover it on speed reading. The other thing to search for are these chests, which come in 3 colors. These can only be unlocked with tokens collected from the action stages. So if you run into one without a token, you're out of luck. Thankfully, any chest you come across will be marked on your map, which is very much appreciated because some of these are very out of the way. In these chests, you'll find concept art, music, or lore explaining Shadow's story from his previous games. All of these are found in a collections room that can be accessed from the pause menu. This is not a real complaint, but I do wish there was a physical door you could just access from the hub. It's not necessary, but I don't know, I like giving it a sense of location. Also love that Shadow just hangs out on his bike when you want to access his lore. Just seeing him dote over it is just a nice subtle character detail that I appreciate. I'm glad the boy has hobbies. I have no idea why they placed Shadow 05 ahead of Sonic Heroes, though. I'd change that in a patch if I were you, Sega. Otherwise, us weirdos will keep whining about it. Anyway, yeah, there's a lot to do in this hub world, and almost everything is easy to see with well-designed landmarks and clever routes that take full advantage of your abilities. But like those chest tokens, you'll need to play the boost stages to get all the other collectibles to progress in the game. So let's finally chat about the stages. A lot of folks were worried about the general level layouts while the game was coming out, but the game runs at a buttery smooth 60 frames a second, clearly telegraphing almost everything that lies in front of you, teasing the player with potential shortcuts or alternate paths with little collectibles, springs, or other little landmarks that are just a bit out of reach. And not always the entrance to the shortcuts. Sometimes they just show you other paths off in the distance, trying to keep that in mind for your next run. And I gotta tell you, it's incredibly satisfying figuring those routes out. This is great incentive to replay and master these levels and those fast twitch controller inputs without having to work around that usual Sonic jank some of these games can be known for. A lot of the time in some of the games represented in these levels, the slightest slip means you'll be careening into a bottomless pit. And yes, I understand a lot of fans feel real good mastering these challenging stages, but a lack of polish and rather intense punishment made the process a very frustrating one back in the day. Shadow Generations boost levels punish failed attempts usually with a slower path, and even then, you're still in for a pretty fun time. That's not to say levels don't have any actual punishment for sloppy gameplay. Each stage does grow progressively more challenging as the game carries on, even learning harder to master Doom powers to the last couple stages. And it also satisfies the joy of exploration, often rewarding you for traveling off the main path, all while helping you improve your general skill level. All the most satisfying things of mastering arcade race courses while still being a platformer in its own right. Gameplay might shift through the years, but this is really the core of what makes Sonic so special compared to his contemporaries. Also, yes, as I mentioned before, the ranking system is back, and yes, it's almost as easy to cheese as the original Sonic generations, but there are some differences. First off, death is no longer a factor. This relies solely on your time. And because of that, I do understand why they remove lives altogether. I mean, they have for the last few games, and I have complained about that in re-releases of other Sonic games, but most of the time they were designed with lives in mind. But here these levels are so well put together, you're likely going to just force a restart anyway if you screw up. Trying to master a run is plenty addicting on its own, and when you just come short of reaching a higher ledge, that will be enough for most fans to just punish themselves and start all over. Because while it sounds like removing death penalties would make things easier, it just made things more streamlined. You can get A ranks without breaking a sweat, and early on S ranks are still real easy, but making that final jump from A to S does become a little more challenging as the game carries on. Even then, it's nothing too demanding, but it requires some genuine effort all the same. Never to the point of real frustration, and it's addicting enough that it will compel a lot of people to just go for broke and just try to 100% everything in this game. Could they have ramped up the difficulty in spots? Sure, and they technically do. Right before the final boss, you unlock harder bosses, challenges, and a second set of S ranks to collect with the Doom rings, as I mentioned before. But even then, it's mostly just a satisfying way to flex all the skills you will master in a very short amount of time, and obviously, all of that is optional. I know a common complaint about the game is that it's too easy and too short, and yeah, I do think it could use a little bit more on both fronts, but just a little bit more. I think it's important for the game to be fun, more than I think it's important for it to be long. 100%ing this game is largely a grand old time. Even if you miss that ledge I mentioned before, you'll likely still have fun on that lower path, and while it can occasionally be more difficult, it will still train you on how to play the game better all the same. So the next time you roll around, you might miss full sections of these carefully laid out levels, and in that sense, it does make exploration fun even in a high-speed setting. And I'm thankful it doesn't overstay its welcome. Trying to do everything in Sonic Frontiers is exhausting and frustrating after a while, but Shadow Generations is a far more focused product that's here for a fun time, but not a long time. I know that's largely because they didn't have 4 years to produce a larger game, but sometimes shorter game experiences are better game experiences, and Sonic is not a game series that should ever feel like a slog. I think this is why something like Miles Morales seemed to get higher praise than Spider-Man 2, because it was all killer, no filler. Didn't have time to prepare a huge 20-hour game, so they just focused on what was fun and got to work. And that's the same story here. And while we are focused on boost stages, I do also want to point out that even the collectibles in the stage work in tandem with the rest of the game. You don't have 5 red rings like Sonic's campaign, but instead 3 tokens, which, like I mentioned before, are used to unlock the chests in the white space area, and I do think that is fairly clever. I also kind of appreciate them knocking the number of collectibles down from 5 to 3. The red rings are fine, but I don't know. I think 3 just hits that sweet spot. Things just get too distracting with any more thrown in there. This is a short game, and these aren't necessary, but I do think that much more would have felt a little bit tedious. And I also appreciate the placement of a lot of these tokens. Some are just on your path, most of the time indicating that you're on the fastest path possible, but some are just really cleverly hidden, requiring you to really pay attention to your surroundings and get creative. Either way, it was always fun tracking these things down, and often when I did, I usually mastered the level well enough to get myself an S rank along the way. When compared to other boost games, I really appreciate how these levels are organized. You take a look at other boost games, and they can be a bit of a mess in terms of layout from stage to stage. Even looking at Sonic Generations, where Act 1 is classic Sonic side-scrolling and Act 2 is modern Sonic Boost, those Act 2 levels still have side-scrolling segments, different from classic Sonic side-scrolling segments. Shadow Generations keeps the camera behind the back of the hedgehog for every Act 1 and leaves all of the side-scrolling strictly in Act 2. And you know what? I can't believe I'm saying this. The side-scrolling is an absolute blast. I've complained about modern Sonic side-scrolling for a good long while. I've never been impressed with them. It's always always been the weakest part of these games, but I finally see the vision. Honestly, it kind of reminds me of the classic games. Everyone hated the water levels right up until they gave us Hydro City, also known as Hydrocity if you still find any semblance of joy and whimsy in your life. They stubbornly stuck with this design and finally made it work. Helps that it's isolated and organized, like this, instead of shifting mid-level and bringing everything to a screeching halt. But on top of that, the general flow of the levels doesn't drastically shift when the perspective does. They still play around with that camera for some set pieces and utilize the same hazards and gimmicks you'll find in Act 1 stages, and they do a great job of keeping that momentum going. It honestly kind of reminds me of Sonic Rush games. Come to think of it, those games really deserve an overhaul for a re-release. But yeah, I like the side-scrolling in a boost game. Never thought I'd see the day. Again, having a set of abilities that expand on the basic goal of moving forward really quickly really helps a lot. If anything, the 2D gameplay actually helps you hone those skills since you're in a more contained environment. I also appreciate the camera still giving you a bit of a view of what's ahead in the speedier sections of the level and making things look a little bit more dynamic when you have a set piece like a pretzel road or swirling rails. I know these little thrills don't require any actual input to the player, but I've always loved them since the Genesis days. They're little rewards for a job well done, giving the player a chance to actually take a very short breather and take in the spectacle of everything happening around them. That has always been the strength of the boost games, especially if you play a level well. Even then, they're still fun to watch if you're not playing them. I think that remains true for all the Act 2 stages and even the smaller challenge stages. And yes, I know some people are upset that you can't skip those, but again, I think they are also well organized. They're over fairly quickly and they genuinely help you get a better handle on your powers and abilities, giving you one set goal, having you do one specific thing. They feel far more intentional than similar attempts at this format. Hell, you can see for yourself if you hop over to Sonic's campaign. I mean, almost any of those cameo missions are just a waste of time. But once again, no matter what you are playing in Shadow's game, it will improve your skill set for the entire experience. I do also think the level choices themselves are very interesting. These levels are all based on games Shadow has appeared in, with one obvious exception. I do also think it's kind of ridiculous that there isn't a single level from Shadow's very own game shown off here, which is a shame. As much hate as that game gets, I do think it had some fun art direction. I love Carnival and Halloween levels, and they were pretty cool in Shadow's game. And I also loved Digital Circuit. I swore they were going to bring that in and tie it in with some cyberspace lore. The parallels are easy enough to make. Or at the very least, Prison Island? I mean, that's the spot where Shadow was awakened from his cryo sleep. That could have been an interesting choice, but oh well. I'm pretty okay with what we got. And no, I do not count Space Colony Arc as Shadow 2005 representation, but I don't know, maybe the devs did. Two birds, one stone, all of that. But what's interesting to me is that this is the starting level. This is where you're meant to get your bearings, where originally in Sonic Adventure 2, this is the level that put all of your skills to the test. Generation swaps the first and last Shadow levels of SA2. So you start with the Arc and then you end with a much more challenging version of Radical Highway. Granted, you get teased by the level constantly in the campaign with all this Inception or Doctor Strange style methods. Pick your reference, I don't care. It looks cool either way. Seen a lot of people ask, why does Black Doom use Radical Highway all the time? And well, I mean, come on, man. Everyone's already sick of Sonic's very first level. They're just playing catch up with Shadow. Don't even worry about it. In no time flat, you'll be saying, ugh, Radical Highway again? Come to think of it, they already used Radical Highway in Generations. It's in the 3DS version, except, you know, it's actually good here. Also, let's take a breather. If you're not a Sonic fan and you're still watching this video, say something in the comments. Genuinely curious. How am I doing? How are you doing? Are you okay? Are you scared? Do you need some water? How'd you get in here? Anyway, yeah, I know it's out of order, but I'm talking about it. This was a great way of incorporating these two levels and flipping the challenge to give us brand new experiences. Starting off in space is not something we've ever done in this series before, and serves as one of many stark contrasts to Sonic's campaign. And by the time we get to Radical Highway, they warp it into a real challenge, even occasionally giving me some Crisis City vibes. Heck, I'd say it's a better Crisis City level than the one from the other campaign. The game is done holding your hand by that point. You need to be ready to homing attack jump rails, shoot chaos spears mid-air. I mean, at least in the standard run. Your first playthrough will be with Doom Wings, if you want them anyway. But even then, they do put up a good challenge for you here. And I think it's kind of cool we end the journey where Shadows first began. But I will once again complain about the lack of fun in some of these designs. You couldn't have put in a giant knight's head from the original game? Come on, man. Also, for real, why does Black Doom keep bringing Shadow back to this City. What connection does he have to it? Radical Highway isn't even in the one game Black Doom was. I'm just playing. I don't actually care. Please don't patch in some weird lore excuses, Ian. I don't mind the Radical Highway intrusions. They are fun, and it's a way to keep Black Doom in as an active antagonist without bringing things to a screeching halt or leaving everything to be explained in cutscenes. It's also very satisfying to finally punch that squiggly little bastard right in its eyes so you can collect a tribal tattoo. I can't believe they made that silly logo an actual collectible. That's fantastic. And all the stages in between these two levels are solid as well. Rail Canyon is one I remember having a hard time with when I first played Sonic Heroes, but I also remember liking it quite a bit. I don't know. I haven't played it in forever. Whatever the case, it was a level I was hoping would make a return. It was a standout from the original release. They got really creative with how they presented the rails in Sonic Heroes, and they're even more fun here. Now, I know rail grinding has been a stripped down experience from the adventure days, but I still think this level and this game in general did a wonderful job varying up the gameplay potential of what's otherwise a very straightforward mechanic. Dodging giant trains, dodging bombs and spikes, hitting switches, all while feeling distinctly different from every other level in the game. It's a great deal of fun while showing a lot of love to the OG version, but I will say I'm noticing a lack of Longhorn Eggman logos, and that is a bummer. Kingdom Valley is also here, and it makes sense. It was the only other choice when it comes to Sonic 06 representation, and I think, weirdly enough, this is my favorite zone in the game, which is wild for me to say because I do not like Sonic 2006, but I really wanted to. Like most of us, this was the first thing I ever saw when they were teasing this game, so it's satisfying to see it here in an actual good finished game. I know, I'm sorry I've not touched Project 06 yet. I really need to, but for right now, it's wild to see this level back in an official capacity. I'm so happy it's a proper damn good time. Just love how everything looks. Love those giant bald eagles, because I'm an American and I really need to make a video talking about the different types of animals in this world because it is crazy. Anyway, the major Doom power for this level is Doom Surf, which I thought was a nice nod to Shadow's hovercraft from 2006. This is the only level that focuses on the surf, and I do believe they did a solid job incorporating it. When the map expands in that first act, it looked like a wild water park, and I had a lot of fun replaying this level, figuring out all the different routes I could take in this one single area. This is also where they introduce an enemy type that requires both Chaos Control and Doom Blast to take out. You don't have to fight the thing, but I like that they start mixing together the different abilities, and it rewards you for being quick about it. And now that I say all that out loud, I wonder if this is actually the first stage to mix them up like that. Man, I just want to go back and play some more of this. I always discover something new, and I've beaten the game twice over already. Also, like they included those water walls with some slight nods to the high-speed section of this level. Gotta love the parting of the sea. Now that I think about it, there's a lot of religious motifs and themes happening in this game. Vector would be proud. Now that I think about it, there's a lot of that stuff in Shadow's overall story. We're gonna talk about this in other videos, and man, we break a lot of stained glass windows. I just love Kingdom Valley, and I've always wanted to love Kingdom Valley, and I'm so happy I can finally love Kingdom Valley. That said, I was not looking forward to the next two levels, seeing as they come from more recent Sonic games. If you own a Switch, you can buy both the titles these zones appear in, and heck, I guess backwards compatibility of the PS5. You get what I'm saying. Sunset Heights is, of course, from Sonic Forces, except this time, it's good. Running from war-torn streets to dropping down into sewers, all of this looks great. And I love that simple environmental storytelling with the water spouting out of the ground because all the damage being done to the sewer system, which you then later run around in. Oh, the hydrosity of it all. And of course, because there's a sewer system here, this does, once again, confirms that these animal people do take poopies in this canon, because I know you are all very worried about that. Sonic shits. And while you're down in the sewers, you come across another enemy that will require you to Chaos Control and Doom Blast if you want to access other routes. And it kind of reminded me of that scrapped red Mecha Sonic design from Sonic Extreme. And speaking of extreme, I know that's an extreme stretch. I do not think for a second that was intentional, especially now that I'm looking at the both of them side by side. I guess I'm more just getting general vibes from it. They're not even really like outside of the color red. Like, I don't even know why I'm talking about it right now. I'm operating just on vibes and a lack of sleep. I'm so tired. I just like this ninja-ass alien, and I like Sonic robots. I don't know. Can't believe this is the only time you interact with those Death Egg robots. I'm not misremembering that, right? You don't actually take on any of them in Sonic Forces. They just do stuff in the background. God, that game is nothing but wasted potential. And while I'm doing my best to avoid fun route discoveries, I just want to say they do some real cool stuff with the chaos control in this level. I'll leave it at that. Also, real quick, I know it would make sense, but now that we're talking about this section, I really wish they brought in Infinite. I can't imagine it would be worth the trouble of trying to explain why Shadow wouldn't remember him later, since Forces happens later in the timeline. But I will say that is one thing from Forces I do hope gets another chance eventually. This campaign is full of characters that deserve some solid writing and redemption, which we will get to shortly, but first, let's finish up describing the stages here with Chaos Island. Gotta say, aesthetically, still not doing it for me. Frontiers is still too fresh. I don't hate the game at all, but I was not a fan of the art direction, and I didn't need more of it. Still, they do a solid job bringing it into this game, and they try to spice things up by bringing in some landmarks from other Starfall islands here, and that volcano in the back implies that Shadow was on the island the same time Sonic was, which is cool. I mean, we do see that busted Death Egg Robo at the start of this level, so obviously, yeah, this happens the same time as Sonic Frontiers. I did get a little outlandish with some of my hopes for environmental storytelling with this level. Like, since this is a time-traveling adventure, I thought it'd be cool if Shadow ran around while the ancients were still active. Would have been cool to see this place actually functioning when it was a society. Again, thinking about Sonic Adventure when you do that with the Echidna tribe, but they have this level here to promote Sonic Frontiers more than anything else, so it's fine the way it is in terms of art direction. I will admit my first time playing this was pretty rough, but game is getting harder by this point. This is the second to last level. And like I mentioned when I was talking about the powers, once you get a handle on the morph ability, you'll barely be touching the ground. I don't think every boost stage needs to reward you by just skipping over most of the stage when you're playing well, but I still did have a blast once I did finally master Chaos Island, and I actually had a lot of fun with every single one of these levels, and it is very satisfying pulling off those risky stunts that keep you up in the air. Again, even if you are a bit more risk averse, you'll still have a solid time on the regular paths. Just keep in mind, the game gets a lot harder, especially right here at Chaos Island, and certainly with Radical Highway. Also wanted to briefly mention the soundtrack. It is, of course, fantastic, which isn't a surprise. I'm not a big fan of the more EDM heavy tracks, but I understand that's personal preference more than it is a commentary on the actual quality of the music. I'm not a fan of the Chaos Island remix, but I certainly understand why it's a favorite for so many others. It's just not for me. Thankfully, I have a lot of other music options. Glad that's a returning feature, and I'm thankful for the wide option of choices. And I was surprised to learn something about myself. I'm a bit warmer on some of the tracks from a lot of these games I thought I hated. Last bit to mention in terms of gameplay and levels has to be the bosses. I mean, I could do a section on challenges, but I think you got the basic idea while I was explaining everything else, right? Anyway, yeah, bosses. And while we talk about them, at this point, full-on narrative spoilers here, because obviously, yeah, even when I'm done talking about the bosses, I'm going to be hopping straight to my thoughts on the story itself after this, so that's your final warning. Like everything else in the game, the boss fights test out the skills you have learned up to whatever point you are at in the story. Each battle focuses on a different Doom ability, and all of them will mix up in some form or fashion, and they pick some solid choices for Shadow to face off against. BioLizard was obvious and necessary. Again, kind of wild to see what was once the final boss in a different game be the first boss in this game. And yes, I know it's not the Final Hazard version, but you know what I'm talking about. The fight kicks off the same as it did in Sonic Adventure 2 without that bullshit water hazard in the middle of the route, so I guess this is technically easier for the first phase, but thankfully they switched things up when they introduced those bubbly arms, making solid use of the Doom Spears and Chaos Control at the end there. It's not super challenging, but it is a fun spectacle, as all these fights will be. But they do grow more challenging, and Metal Overlord, I would argue, is actually a bit more of a challenge than the other bosses. Well, the other bosses that aren't the final boss. Anyway, yeah, Metal Overlord has never been my favorite robot design, and once again, I'm still a bit bitter we didn't get a proper fight with his previous form, Neo Metal Sonic, but shout out to Sonic Roblox for finally providing that for me. This battle has you surfing the whole time, and I think they did a great job incorporating the ability here. There are a lot more phases that really test out how well you can wiggle around with your Manta Ray, and there's a little Ganondorf tennis match at the end, and a big ship, also, just like Sonic gets a rematch with a boss that required a super form, we get that paralleled here in this fight between Shadow and Metal. It's a lot of fun. Now look, I have whined and complained about Sonic 06 a lot on this channel, even in this video. Game broke my heart and all that, but I've always loved Mephiles, even if before I didn't say his name right, and I was so excited to see his return here. And like I said, even the hub world does a great job building up to this rematch. The music changes completely, and I wish there was an option to do that with the overworld now that I think about it. And the fight itself is plenty fun, doing its best to show off everything this baddie is known for. Get a brief glimpse at his transformation, those creepy shadow minions, all that fun stuff. All while seeing how well the player has mastered the Doom Morph and Doom Blast abilities. There's not too many fights, and they are fun, but I do have to admit I was a little disappointed we didn't get a little more time with these enemies. But this does have to be a Generations game to some degree, so I understand the lack of cutscenes for these sections, and they at least give some dialogue during the actual fights. It's not much, but they make damn use of the time they have. The Bio-Lizard obviously didn't have much to say, but Shadow showing pity for its very existence was awesome. And then having two characters designed to be Sonic clones talk trash to each other was very satisfying. And good God, Mephiles, a copy of a copy made irrelevant, struggling to survive only to be punked out by someone who doesn't even remember him. I love that he doesn't try his usual shenanigans. I thought he'd start things off with boasting, but he is pissed and he is desperate. He doesn't start off with sass like he did in Sonic 06. He just straight up attempts to murder Shadow right off the bat with the move that killed Sonic, and apparently that's the actual name of the move officially. I love this franchise. All that being said, don't like his voice. I mean, the actor did a solid job, but I just don't think he was the right fit. But it's hard to follow up on the Pharaoh. You should have had the Pharaoh, though. I mean, hell, we're even fighting in a pyramid. It's time to Dan Green. It's time to Dan Green. That's a normal sentence. But yeah, with or without Yu-Gi-Oh, hearing this angry little guy screaming, "I want to exist," will probably be a standout moment for this franchise overall. It was wonderful. I hope we see more of Mephiles, but if that's all we get, that was pretty cool. And of course, Black Doom is back with a Devil Doom battle, and then a brand new Neo Devil Doom. It's like an organic version of a Metal Overlord. That's a cool concept. Still hate Metal Overlord's design, and this is just uglier, but it is still cool. This final battle tests not only the freshly acquired Doomwing, but every other ability at your disposal. Something that rarely happens in final confrontations in Sonic games, since they usually base it around the super forms, so they just try to make a challenge out of invulnerability. They don't do that here, so this quickly becomes one of the most challenging yet most fair final fights I have ever seen in any Sonic game. I will be making videos about each and every one of these boss baddies, so I apologize if it seemed like I was rushing through this fairly quickly, but yeah, this video is already going on so long, and I have so much left to say. But I will say, in terms of narrative, they did a fantastic job showing the relationship Shadow has with each and every one of these baddies and how they reflect him as a character, which any good villain roster should do. Again, he is playing Batman in that crossover for a reason. But speaking of fun little back and forths, I of course need to praise the script, which is penned by, thank God, Ian Flynn. I know there are some outspoken haters of his work, and I do not care. That said, I do understand some of the critiques and concerns after Frontiers, but because a lot of folks just refuse to believe Ian can write Shadow well, thanks to some very specific things from IDW, after this game and Dark Beginnings, I think it's safe to say this guy knows what he's doing. And even if you aren't completely satisfied, we still have someone who has a lot of experience and has a lot of love and passion for this franchise and these characters, and he's giving an earnest, sincere crack at said characters. And that alone is pretty great, especially since the game has to serve the greater role of bringing in a larger audience who will be rolling in after Sonic Movie 3. They can't just satisfy the very nitpicky expectations of people who yell on Twitter. And I believe there is a lot of fan service here, and they cover the broad strokes of what matters about Shadow and his journey and his relationships. They covered all that stuff very well, and they leave room to grow. We are in a much better place with this hedgehog than we were just a couple years ago. On its own terms, I think the story is solid, especially considering it needs to begin and end within the confines fans of Sonic generations, without it being a giant contradiction. That said, I do think this video is already dragging on long enough. I haven't even covered Sonic's campaign, and you all know how long I can ramble just on the subject of characters on their own terms. Each of them deserve proper analysis, especially the Robotnik family. Gerald is a very interesting man. So yeah, we will be fairly quick with the story this time around, but let's still briefly touch on some of these cutscenes. From moment one, you could tell there is a massive step up in terms of cinematography and animation, especially considering what we've come to expect when it comes to recent Sonic games. Starting off with a somber reflection aboard the Space Colony Ark, and even cutting quickly over to Sonic's birthday party to really feel just how different the tone of this campaign will be. Traveling through time and their own personal histories should feel radically different from each of the two hedgehogs. Sonic just hops from one adventure to the next simply for the thrill of it. Shadow, on the other hand, has actively tried to move on from his past, but it somehow keeps coming back to haunt him. Traveling through time would not be a fun thing for him. We literally start the story where his life first began and where he lost his first family. This all leads to the first level, which again was the last level of his story in Sonic Adventure 2, and I do think that's a real cool touch the more I think about it. This is also the first time Black Doom introduces himself. I do wish he had a bit more of an entrance instead of just showing up mid-level as a squiggly little demon eye, but whatever, it's still rad. Anyway, moving on. It won't be much of a surprise to anybody, but a time-traveling Shadow means an inevitable reunion with Maria, and it plays out less emotionally charged than you might expect. I understand some fans being disappointed in how Shadow first reacts when it comes to the reunion with Maria, but I do think this game and the content surrounding it has done a solid job explaining that Shadow not only has a hard time expressing himself, but he has gone through a lot since Maria's passing. He spent a long time trying to overcome his past, and now it's staring him in the face. I wouldn't exactly know how to handle that either. So instead of breaking down in tears or shouting with joy, which, I mean, that's just not something Shadow really does, he instead focuses on a mission, thinking about potentially changing her fate so he doesn't have to lose her again. And I think that's part of the growth he's going through in this game. He isn't being present in the moment, cherishing the miracle and appreciating this fleeting chance to spend a little more time with his family. That's something Rouge kind of reminds him of in her flavor text. And Stevie again pointed this out, and I have to fully agree. I do appreciate this more nuanced and complicated reaction, and Rouge speaking to Shadow like a proper adult, reminding him that he isn't the same person they knew 50 years ago, and while he should cherish his time with them, he does have to stay focused on the problem at hand. He can't just wallow in the past. There's a problem happening right now. Of course, I'm giving the character all this praise, even though later on she gives us this delivery.
Whatever.
I'm glad y'all had fun in the studio that day, guys, but maybe we could have just done one more take. I do also feel they do a pretty good job showing some subtle reactions to Gerald. Shadow almost looks like a beaten dog, and if you know what Gerald has done, you can understand why. Then again, I might be projecting here a little bit. Hopefully that reaction was intentional because Shadow doesn't really touch on all that stuff too much in his own inner dialogue. But then again, Gerald does give an appropriate send-off to Shadow, apologizing for what he's done, but proud of Shadow for how he's handled it. You can tell there's a complicated relationship not being discussed, which, well, I mean, is that all that different when it comes to fathers and sons having a hard time expressing their feelings to each other? I don't know. I really just like these interactions. Oh, in another cutscene, we finally get some proper conversation between Black Doom and Shadow, even though it's once again through the Doom Eye, but I love that Shadow just immediately attacks the thing. He actually just punches it every time it shows up in the game, which is incredibly satisfying, especially after just playing through Shadow's 2005 game recently. Seeing Shadow wreck it in this cutscene only to have it pop back in like nothing happened was really funny. I do want to take a moment to whine about some missed potential here though. Black Doom was never all that deep of a character, but I was expecting just a little bit more from him, but things kind of remain vague. Like, I didn't need him to be a deep, complicated character, but I was hoping to get a little bit more context to what his plan was or what he was trying to do or how he came back, because at first I expected his return to be tied in with the Time Eater. Obviously, things wrecking time, things are out of whack, and what was once a dead enemy comes back to life, but then it seems like he was completely unrelated to the Time Eater. He just grew a new body from the larva that was left over on Space Colony Ark. But when you listen to some of Gerald's hypothesizing, it almost makes me think like the broken timeline accelerated Black Doom's regeneration, or at least he was able to take advantage stage of the broken timeline, I don't understand how he can completely control the realm of Radical Highway. I don't know, am I missing something here? It's one of those situations where the story feels so straightforward that it's almost too linear, like it's missing some details in its simplicity. Like, I was expecting Black Doom to bring up an ultimatum about Shadow being able to save Maria and Gerald from their grim fate, make some sort of Faustian deal. I mean, Gerald talks about making a deal with Black Doom. He is basically alien Satan. I don't know, whatever. Time travel stuff is nonsense and we can pick it apart all day, and I'm not going to dock points for a story I was anticipating or theorizing on before this game came out. I just feel like they could have pushed a little harder with his motivations as a villain, or at least I would have liked to hear more about it. But we also know how these stories generally go. We always knew that Maria and Gerald would have to go back to their normal time, but it was still nice seeing these characters be an active part of a game story for a change, instead of just being broken memories and journal entries. Oh, and speaking of, be sure you get all that extra dialogue and text through said journal entries or by talking to characters in the white space in between unlocking levels, because this is where the real fun nuggets are, like mystery family members, or Maria being aware of Sonic, or Gerald explaining why Mephiles, Sunset Heights, or even Chaos Island are even here. There is a lot worth picking apart in these short conversations, and of course, Ian loves writing Omega, and he gets some fantastic lines here, so talk to the robot. I also wanted to talk about this quick interaction Shadow has with Sonic. I was expecting him to be another boss fight, but I can see why they opted to just make this a cutscene battle instead of a redundant boss battle, since we already have a Sonic versus Shadow fight in Sonic Generations. But I appreciate a chance to see Sonic from someone else's perspective, and he's kind of a dick, and I kind of love that. Granted, Shadow doesn't really seem open to having a constructive conversation. We get to see a fight quickly play out in this cutscene where Sonic wins and just runs off with the emerald, but not realizing that Shadow swapped it out for a fake, which I haven't mentioned prior to this point, but that is a lovely callback to Sonic Adventure 2 and a clever way to not contradict the original generation story when Sonic is running around collecting emeralds, but Shadow still needs an emerald to use his abilities. Speaking of, we also see from Shadow's perspective that he had a chance to use the Doom powers on Sonic while his back was turned, but opted not to. He later on tells Rouge that he will only beat Sonic on equal footing or not at all, which does show a genuine respect for Sonic's capabilities and to their rivalry, but I also think it's Shadow trying to prove something to himself by not giving in to the darker path that Black Doom is trying to entice him to go down. It's just a nice little scene, and of course I just like Sonic being a dick. I don't like him always being a goody two-shoes hero, and in the eyes of Shadow, he certainly is not that whatsoever. Just a nice quick little glimpse into their rivalry. It's fun. The other big story point I wanted to touch on for this video is of course the ending. Just as fans will likely be unhappy with how the initial reunion with his family went, I'm sure we will hear some frustration with how they part ways. Once Black Doom is defeated, all the timeline nonsense he was screwing around with begins to heal, meaning that Gerald and Maria will too return to their normal time. Shadow, frustratingly, understands the danger he can put everyone and everything in if he warns these two about their gruesome fate. He instead resists the urge and blasts off towards the final confrontation with the Time Eater to swap out emeralds with Sonic, all before Gerald and Maria fully finish fading away. And Shadow races past Rouge, who was already on her way to Sonic, and doesn't even slow down or spare a word to the bat, but a single tear flies through the air and splashes against her cheek, and she looks on ahead at Shadow with a smile. And that's how the game ends. And man, that's a great little conclusion if you ask me. Maybe Black Doom didn't bother with any ultimatums, but he really didn't need to. Shadow had the perfect opportunity to protect the people he misses the most in the world, the girl who inspired his heroic journey. But to truly respect her wishes, he has to let her die all over again. He has to set the timeline right. He can't change things up for his own selfish desires. That's not something Maria would want, and while it was good to see her again, she is still ultimately a ghost. I think running away when he did was a powerful and important choice for this story. He certainly gets a lot more closure throughout the adventure, and that was very nice, but it still kind of mirrors SA2 in the sense that he wasn't actually there for Maria's final moments. He did see her get shot, yeah, but he was jettisoned away before she passed on, and he certainly wasn't there for Gerald's execution. In Shadow Generations, Shadow once again everyone leaves without giving a proper goodbye to these two. But this time, he is making that choice. Partially because it'd be like watching them die all over again, and that would be too much. And I also think it's because Shadow doesn't completely trust himself not to tell them about their future, so he removes himself from the situation, removes the temptation completely. Through the game, we have seen him overcome the dark influence of Black Doom as he grew more and more powerful with new abilities, even if they felt natural, even if they made Shadow feel complete in a way he never had before, he still rejected the evil influence of Doom, letting go of his violent rage, largely thanks to the literal embodiment of everything good and pure, at least what he sees as the literal embodiment of everything good and pure. At first, I thought throwing off the influence was as throwaway as getting rid of Sonic's corruption in vanilla Sonic Frontiers, but the more I think about it, this showed a lot of growth for Shadow, and at the same time, getting the character back on track without completely disregarding how the character had changed in Sonic media through this past decade. And really, the greatest challenge of his adventure wasn't overcoming those violent tendencies or alien control. It wasn't fighting demigod abominations that even time itself didn't want. No, the greatest challenge he had to face was letting go of Maria all over again for the sake of the greater good. Throughout this whole adventure, Shadow was trying to get a handle on himself, and he only really did that by finding some sense of inner peace, by letting go of rage and negativity, by learning some long-lost self-control, and the last great challenge of that was running away from Maria. And I thought that single tear was handled very beautifully. We never actually see Shadow shed that tear because he refuses to let anyone see him in pain, and I think that includes this audience. But having it splash against Rouge is a reminder to her and to us that Shadow does still have a very tight circle of people who love him and understand him and his language, no matter what kind of front he puts up. I think that's why Rouge gave him that little smile. She knows that what he endured was painful, but she knows that Shadow ultimately has his heart in the right place, and as bittersweet as it was, Shadow, I believe, was ultimately thankful for the chance to see Maria one last time. And because of that, he did get some sense of closure and can maybe finally properly heal. When he told Maria that he was letting go of that rage, he really meant it. This also parallels Shadow's journey in his own game when he talks about moving on from his past, but now he has to do it more literally than we've ever seen before. This was the ultimate test, and he passed. He didn't even actually say goodbye to these two, but that's okay, because they already know his heart as well, and he already said everything he needed to say to Maria and Gerald when he said that he would carry on the promise he made to Maria. And that small smile he drops is just perfect. He doesn't smile very often, so you know it means something special when it happens. I could keep going, and in the future I most definitely will. This title is going to be a part of the Sonic discourse for a very long time. I know a lot of this video feels like I'm praising some fairly obvious game design philosophy, but there has been a very vocal part of the Sonic community that has, for a very long time, seen something special in these games that other Sonic fans and the larger gaming community simply dismissed. This is the Shadow generation, and this is their game. I've had my debates with a lot of those folks, but at the end of the day, the point of this channel was always to find the beauty in every corner of this medium, and every single game represented here in Shadow Generations was eventually going to show up on Game Apologist, and they still will. But for the first time since I started this journey, I am genuinely excited to go back to all of those titles after all of this time with a fresh perspective, and to see how some of the most notorious Sonic titles managed to inspire one of the best, a game that IGN ranked higher than the most recently released Mario RPG, which is just insane to see. I don't want any game to be bad. I respect developers now more than ever, and I do actually genuinely adore Mario games. But I gotta admit, I couldn't help but smile when I saw people flexing that a little bit. This franchise needed that fire, that schoolyard trash talk that brought Sonic to the table to begin with. This series has always had something special about it, something different from everybody else. It has always had the potential to be one of the greats because that's how the story started. It was one of the greats, and this game is as well. That's why I love that Shadow Generations is packed in with Sonic Generations, because it shouldn't be a debate between Sonic fans. Classic or modern, return, 2D or 3D, momentum or boost, there's room at the table for all of us, and this combined package proves just that. Now, we shouldn't be fighting with other fans. If you want to talk trash, it should be with Mario fans or Nintendo fans or people who can genuinely see and respect the quality of the different series they're debating. Not saying get all toxic with it, I'm just saying you can have fun debates, and Sonic has always deserved to be in the upper echelon of platformers. And now, one of the greatest they've ever concocted is built with the bones of some of the most shameful moments of Sonic history. Built with all that earnesty, all that sincerity, all that drama that fans have been desperate to see for a very long time. And that darker tone can exist right alongside the more light-hearted, fun nonsense that you see from the other campaign. It all fits, and it all works, and it's all welcome. Every version of Sonic deserves recognition, and everyone who is passionate about this franchise, whatever branch of the franchise that may be, deserves recognition. You don't need to stick to one specific style to make this work. You just need to make it good, and the rest will speak for itself. As a classic fan, I have had a lovely return to form with Sonic Mania. Superstars isn't as great, but it's still a solid time, and I don't for a second think we won't eventually get another great classic style game, but man, it feels so good to see other aspects of this franchise be in that same conversation. And Shadow Generations proves that even the worst of the franchise has something wonderful to offer. Don't be ashamed of any part of this history. Embrace all of it, and the fan base in turn will celebrate it, no matter what generation of Sonic fan you are. And that, my friends, is going to do it for today. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. I'm going to cut straight to the Patreon readouts because I'm very tired and I've been recording for a very, very long time. But sincerely, thank you guys so much for speaking about my passions and letting me be a giant dork here. Hope I bring you guys some kind of entertainment. I know there's been a lot of stress with real world stuff as of this recording, so hey, maybe let's not waste time with petty arguments between other fans. We're all here because we love this stuff. We just got a lovely game featuring a celebration of everything having to do with the Sonic games, and I think that title alone proves that all of us are worth celebrating, no matter how young or old you are. If you love Sonic, be a part of the conversation, be a part of the community. Yeah, I'm just getting corny in my exhaustion. Said I was going to jump straight to the Patreon readout, so yes, thank you guys for watching till the end. Thank you so much for the patrons who support this channel. If you want to join them, link below if you feel like it. But yeah, extra special thank you to these folks here: Kyle Winter, Cyrus the Skeptic, Joseph Duncan, Sonic 2 Blue, Josh Strider, Trey Nobles, Hatsworth, Tiny Jericho, Ginger Bob, Jack of All Spades, Tristan Trapp, Meekers, Bo Bennings, Quote Resident Fanboy, Miles the Prower, Singer J199, Sam Webster, Fish Flop, Lucas Lipker, The Bad Pal, Jonathan Dobbs, Clover Chats, Chad, Mr. SP, Cecil the Glade, The Dark Neon, Stefan Plakanica, 3monic, Graham J. Hall, Lenny X, Wayne is Boss, Letteric, David 20 Covers, Trash Baphomet, Anderjack 5, Grayson Conager, Xerxes the Renegade Jin, Ken K, Then 101, Paxton Bisbee, Sindarin 7, Bunny, Twilord. Did you know this entire video was AI generated? I hate AI, but God, I wish it was. I am very tired. Crimson Rose, Roxas the Cat, Godzilla, Makuta of Salt, Gleam the Anomaly, Alexander Watson, Neil Gampa, Conan Kudo, the Lex, the most powerful ship in the two universes, Kaido Prower, Spearmint, the Real Game Apologist currently locked in a basement. This creative video maker AI took over my house. Send help, please hurry. Oh God, are we just in a new arc right now? Am I real? Is any of this? Oh God, I've not slept all night. I'm not ready for an existential crisis. Omega Man 21, Penn Adelaide, Daza S, the world's most unironic 8.5 tail stand, One More Sonic Robot, MT Mecha, Gob, the RSI, Captain, 7 Sol survivors were picked up by the RMS Nux, Salem Hollow, Siegfried Wilder, Nabern Yurd, KB, Tenrik Terror, and Cho Henshin. I love you guys. Am I done with this? Yes, that's done. That's a lot of, wow, that is a lot of people. 69? Nice. Toot toot, Shadow Warriors.